This is the last presentation for the Kennedy and Johnson unit. So at this point, I've had a few presentations recorded for you. One was the election of 1960, where President Kennedy defeated Richard Nixon. Then I had two review presentations for you, one for JFK's domestic policy and one for his foreign policy. And then I had another presentation about the assassination of President Kennedy. This last presentation, and you'll notice I have his name highlighted there in yellow, is about President Johnson. And President Johnson was the vice president for President Kennedy. And when Kennedy was assassinated, Johnson took over November 22nd, 1963. So he basically finished the last year of Kennedy's first term and then ran for president on the Democratic ticket in 1964. So LBJ's path to the presidency was unlike a lot of other presidents. The last president to be assassinated was William McKinley at the turn of the 20th century when Teddy Roosevelt became the president. Um, it had been 60 years, give or take, since this type of movement into the presidency has occurred. So he was immediately the 36th president upon JFK's assassination. And you see the picture here. This is one of the more iconic pictures in American history. This is a photo of Johnson swearing in to be the 36th president of the United States on Air Force One, which is the president's plane. And the plane is still on the ground in Dallas while this is happening. In fact, if you look, this is Jackie Kennedy, and if you look closely, you can see the look of shock and horror that's still really on her face um, following the death of her husband. And a lot of people want to know why they didn't wait to get back to Washington, D.C. for him to swear in. And the reasoning is at the time, they didn't know who had shot him or why, or if it was a larger plan to kill more leaders. And so they didn't want to go so many hours without having an active president. So President Johnson swore in right away on Air Force One before they took off to head back to D.C. And when he got back to DC, he gave a very moving speech. And he talked about how he wanted to start the recovery process right away. And he said, all I have, I would have given gladly not to be standing here today. This was a grief-stricken nation. You had this very popular, very beloved president who was gunned down. And so Johnson swore that he would help the nation recover and to heal from this tragedy. Interestingly, President Johnson is actually one of the conspiracy theories for President Kennedy. It doesn't have a lot of grounds and a lot of evidence to back it up, but it is a theory. And the reasoning is because he did seek the presidency for a very long time. In fact, his entire political career, he was aspiring to work his way up to be the president of the United States. Um, so a little bit of background on his political experience. So he was what we call a New Deal Democrat. He was a supporter of FDR, and you see he goes back in his political experience all the way back to 1937. Johnson had been around a very long time. He was a Democrat, but he was also from Texas, which made him pretty popular among the southern states, which Kennedy was not. So, so that he had that going for him. He also had very unstoppable ambition and a lot of political savvy. He was very, very skillful with political maneuvering. He could persuade you, um, and he used the political system to accomplish his goals. And I'll show you how in a minute. He did run for president in 1960 in the primaries, and he ran against Kennedy, and he lost against Kennedy. The Democratic Party gave Kennedy the nomination, but Kennedy then selected Lyndon Johnson to be his vice president. So in the election of 1964, like I said, Johnson um, finished Kennedy's last year. So from November 63, when Kennedy was killed, through Election Day 64, he inherited that year, but then he had to run for president in the election of 1964, and he ran against a guy named Barry Goldwater. As you can see on the map, all of the blue states are states that Lyndon Johnson won. All of the red states are the states that Barry Goldwater ran or won. Um, in fact, Lyndon earned the nickname Landslide Lyndon because of this election. He took 61% of the popular vote, which is huge. And if you look at the electoral vote, it was 486 to 52. Now, why such a landslide? Well, number one, he was the VP to Kennedy, so he had that card to play. But also, Barry Goldwater he was a nutcase. I'm just going to say it. He was a nutcase. He was ultra conservative, like crazy conservative and excessive. By 1964, the civil rights movement is well on its way to successful legislation granting rights to people of different races. Yet Barry Goldwater, when he was running for president, said that he would repeal any of the laws and any of the progress. He was very much against equality between blacks and whites. Hence why states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia voted for him. But the other thing that made him even crazier was the fact that he had no problem with military leaders using nuclear weapons on a battlefield. He wanted to give any military leader access to those nuclear weapons. And Johnson played on that, knowing coming off of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the fear that nuclear war could happen. Johnson played off of those fears and basically exposed him as a nut job. Why would you want to have the possibility of nuclear war? So that being said, Johnson won in a landslide. So once he becomes the president and then wins re-election in 1964, he puts into place what becomes known as the Great Society. Now, remember, Kennedy's domestic policy was called the New Frontier. And we said that New Frontier really meant space, and we said how successful Kennedy was with the space program, but he wasn't so successful with pushing some of the other domestic issues like fighting for the end of poverty and helping the poor and proposing tax cuts and civil rights and things like that. Johnson and his Great Society is basically going to pick up where Kennedy left off. And like I told you on the first slide, he was very, very politically savvy. This is one of my favorite pictures. Okay, here's Johnson. Okay, and this action of Johnson, you can see he has very little regard for personal space. This is known as the Johnson treatment. So let's say there was something Johnson wanted to get done or Johnson wanted to get passed in Congress. He would do his research on who would agree with him and who he knew wouldn't vote for it. And he would find the people that weren't going to vote for whatever he was proposing, and he would find them and he would talk to them, and he would talk and talk and talk and push and push and push, and he would get so close to your face that you'd be invading your personal space. One of the guys that he got in his face before, a legislator, said his face a scant millimeter from his target, and you can see how close he's getting. And he just had a way of maneuvering his way to get things passed. So his Great Society, like I said, is an extension of Kennedy's New Frontier. Johnson is going to propose civil rights legislation, which we will talk about in the Civil Rights Unit, which is next week. But it's going to be Johnson that gets civil rights bills passed. It's going to be Johnson that gets the tax cut bill that Kennedy wanted. And then he's also going to be focusing on public education and medical care and poverty. And if you're looking at all of those things in this paragraph, hopefully they're looking familiar to you from what Kennedy was proposing. So some of the highlights, oh, there's the Johnson treatment again, okay, right in your face. But some of the major, and there were a ton of different areas with the Great Society, but I highlighted some of the ones that number one, the book highlights, but number two, were very similar to what Kennedy had proposed as well. The first thing we talked about was Kennedy wanting a tax cut over the course of 3 years. And remember, Kennedy said the idea here would be that if we cut taxes, more people would have money in their pockets and more people would then spend that money. And one of the reasons that Kennedy didn't get it passed is because Congress turned around and said, well, yeah, well, there's going to be a budget deficit and we need the money. Well, Johnson takes this idea and he proposes the tax cut. And Congress says the same thing to him. Well, Johnson, there's going to be a deficit. And then Johnson turns around with a list and says, well, here are all of the areas of our budget where we can actually cut spending. So he expands Kennedy's ideas to include, all right, well, if you're saying we're not going to have enough money, well, let's cut what we're spending. And it worked. Each year of this tax cut, each year of Johnson's term, the GNP, or the gross national product, increased. Each year, the deficit actually shrank, okay, because people actually were working again, unemployment fell, they were spending their money, so the government was generating different types of tax revenues. So it worked. Okay? Um, the next thing on the list, and this one was very near and dear to Johnson's heart, was he, quote, declared war on poverty. Johnson was from Texas, and he had grown up in poverty. He was a young man during when the Great Depression started, and he saw that changeover from the 20s to the 30s. But despite the booms of the 20s, he still lived in impoverished areas. So he very much took this idea to heart. He declared unconditional war on poverty in America. And one of the first things he did was he passed the Economic Opportunity Act in the summer of '64. And his ideas were, we might not be able to eliminate poverty this second, but if we can eliminate the causes of poverty, then poverty will shrink exponentially and gradually as we move through. So he felt that the causes of poverty were illiteracy, meaning uneducated, unemployment, and inadequate public services. If people aren't going to be able to take care of themselves, they'll never get a job, they'll never be able to improve their lives. Okay, so he thought, let's combat these areas. Let's fix education. Let's create jobs. Let's provide services for people so they can contribute to society. And over the course of this program, the act provided nearly $950 million for 10 separate projects, including work training programs. So also providing skills for people so that they can get jobs. Okay. Another important piece to the war on poverty is what he called Head Start programs. Again, one of the causes of poverty is illiteracy, or not being educated, not being able to read and write. And he believed that Head Start would help with that. Head Start is basically a preschool program, so getting kids in school earlier, but especially in low income areas. So, because a lot of times if you're from an impoverished neighborhood, you're not going to school until maybe kindergarten or first grade. And by then, you're already kind of behind. Okay? Because if you can combat illiteracy sooner, then maybe you'll be more successful going through your school years. So he provided Head Start. And then he created something called VISTA, which is Volunteers in Service to America, and basically sends volunteers to help people in poor communities. Okay. Now, it sounds very much like the Peace Corps, but VISTA was focused here at home. Okay. Again, Johnson was very much focused on what was happening here in the United States. This cartoon I included, I do like it, and it shows Johnson playing a piano, and you see the piano is labeled the 88th Congress. And the idea of this cartoon is that he's playing Congress like an instrument, and all the lovely music coming out are all of the things that he's able to get past, showing the success of his great society. The next two areas that are tied directly to President Kennedy are aid to education and medical care. Again, Kennedy felt that improving education and providing federal funds for education would help states, uh, help schools, especially in lower income areas. Once again, Kennedy wasn't able to get it passed, but Johnson was. And in 1965, he passed the Elementary and Secondary Act, where $1.3 billion went to the states. And because, like I told you before, states control education. And so Johnson wanted to provide money to those states. And those funds went to all different types of schools. They went to public schools, Catholic schools, other private schools, to help give them the resources and the materials that they need to educate and take care of the kids, so that the kids could then in turn become more productive and more educated and then be more successful once they got out of school. Next is medical care. Again, Kennedy proposed federal medical care for people who could not get private insurance. Like we said, people that have jobs, the jobs provide private insurance, and that's great. But by the time we get into the 60s and 70s, people are getting used to their medical insurance. Well, once they retire, they lose that insurance because they don't have that job anymore. Um, so Kennedy proposed care for the elderly. He got it blocked in Congress. Johnson, through his political maneuvering, was able to get it passed. Medicare provided hospital care and low-cost insurance to most Americans 65 and older. And if you know somebody who is retired, think of your grandparents maybe, or even your parents. They could be on Medicare right now if they're retired and they don't have any other supplemental insurance. There's nothing wrong with Medicare. It's provided for you because you now are retired and don't have a job. A few years later, Medicare was expanded to Medicaid. And it's the same idea. It's low cost insurance and hospital coverage for Americans who are poor. Anybody around that poverty line, Americans of any age who can't afford their private insurance. And this protects people that are unemployed or unable to work. And a number of years later was actually expanded to cover Americans with disabilities. Okay? Because for many people with disabilities, they can't hold a job. Um, so it's not that they're necessarily poor, it's they have a disability and they can't work, so Medicaid covers them as well. And then last idea here is immigration reform. Immigration Act of 1965 basically changed the quotas of how many immigrants were allowed in the United States per year. 20,000 immigrants per year were allowed from any one country outside the Western Hemisphere, and only a total of 170,000 immigrants from the Eastern Hemisphere combined were allowed to come. So it could be 20,000 per country, but once those countries outside the Western Hemisphere reached 170,000, it was capped. They wanted to control who was coming into the country, and of course, they were vetting all of these immigrants because of the fear of communism. So those are some of the highlights of the Great Society. Again, a lot of things that Kennedy had actually proposed, but was unsuccessful in getting passed. Now, Johnson also continued working with NASA and expanding the Mercury and Gemini and Apollo programs. And then, of course, Richard Nixon will be the president when we do get to the moon. So that those programs are continued as well. Johnson also, um, even though Nixon gets the credit for it, Johnson was also the first president to really push for environmental reforms and to kind of slow down pollution and car emissions and protect the water and protect the air. Again, those things aren't going to be passed until the Nixon administration, but Johnson does propose those things through his Great Society. Another part of the Johnson administration is the rulings of the Supreme Court. When we talked about the Kennedy assassination, we talked about the Warren Commission, named after Chief Justice Earl Warren. There he is. Okay, he is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court during these Kennedy Johnson years. And Earl Warren was one of our more liberal chief justices that we've had over the course of history. And it's during this decade, the 1960s, that you see a ton of different changes. And even going back to the 50s, even with civil rights, a ton of changes protecting the rights of the American people. Earl Warren was very concerned with protecting the constitutional rights of individuals against the power of the government. So some of the highlights of things that you might have heard of before that came out during the Johnson years in the Warren Court: social issues such as prayer in public schools. It's going to be during the Warren years, during the Warren Court, that praying in a public school is unconstitutional because it's violating the First Amendment right of separation of church and state. Another major issue is that there was a law in Connecticut that actually prohibited women from using birth control, and the women sued, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the court said that that law was unconstitutional, and that women should be allowed to use birth control. Some criminal procedures. Earl Warren very much believed that even if you were being arrested for a crime, you had rights. So some of the cases under his administration were if evidence is tampered with or taken illegally, it can't be used in trial. That if you can't afford a lawyer, one can be provided for you. You have the right to free legal aid. And then, of course, I hope you've never experienced it, but I'm sure you have heard of what are called the Miranda rights, that a suspect upon being arrested is warned of their rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one will be provided for you. Again, the idea of even if you are being arrested, you still have some constitutional rights. And another big part of the Warren Court was the importance of electoral distribution, especially when it comes to voting. As people were moving across the different states, many of them were moving from rural America into more suburban or urban areas. But the problem was voting lines, voting districts were not redrawn to reflect the shift in demographic or the shift in where people are living. So the Warren Court came up with this one man, one vote idea that basically said every person's vote should carry the same weight regardless of where they live, and that the number of votes available should be based on the population. The big thing here, okay, is this piece. And I know on your note sheet you don't have anything to fill out here, but this is something to keep in mind. The Warren Court was considered very, very controversial. It's also going to be during this Warren Court that we have a lot of civil rights legislation, and the idea of segregation is going to be overturned through Earl Warren and Lyndon Johnson. They thought he was too liberal, and they thought his interpretation of the Constitution was too loose. However, it is argued that because we had a Lyndon Johnson and an Earl Warren in the 60s, a lot of the movements of the 60s and 70s were actually pretty successful. So the effects of the Great Society. So just to kind of like wrap it up here, Lyndon Johnson wins the election of 64, and he'll serve that term. Because of what's happening in the Vietnam War, which we'll get to later, he actually decides not to run in 1968. Technically, he would have been allowed to run in 1968 for his second term. and he chooses not to. So he really only serves 5 years as president. Um, he was very successful at first. We talked about, the tax cuts and Medicare, Medicaid, and aid to education. We'll talk about in the civil rights movement how he does get big legislation passed to guarantee equality among race and to protect voting rights for Americans based on race. And some of the opinion polls in 1964, um, some people were even saying that maybe he was more popular than Kennedy because of his success. But a lot of his success was early on in his presidency. As we get towards the later half of his presidency, some of the things he was proposing weren't met. Poverty, for example, poverty drops a little bit once the Great Society is put into play, but in the long run, all the government spending in the world is not enough to eliminate all of poverty. We still have poverty today. Because of the civil rights legislation, which is a good thing, the legal changes were great, but the social changes didn't come with it. You can change the laws, but you don't necessarily change the people. And there was a lot of conflict that came out of the civil rights legislation. And then the same old argument that you hear all the time. You heard this with the New Deal, you even hear it today. People complain that their tax money is going to the poor, and why is their hard earned money going to the poor? And will too many people become dependent on the government or welfare? Too much power to the government. So anytime a president or an administration, regardless of what side of the fence they're on, anytime they do too much of something, they're going to be criticized for it. And so that those are just typical, beliefs. However, again, overall, when the Great Society came out, poverty did drop. Okay, poverty was reduced. It didn't stay that way, but at least it helped for the moment. And then just some key differences here between the two guys. LBJ was very, very proud and pretty successful with his domestic policy. His foreign policy, which we'll just touch on in a second for just a moment, isn't going to be as popular. Whereas JFK, on the other hand, was more concerned and more successful with his foreign affairs. With the exception of the Bay of Pigs invasion, JFK was very successful with stopping war over Berlin and confronting the Soviet Union when it came to Cuba. I mean, we were on the brink of nuclear war, and JFK outsmarted the Soviet Union. So the two men had a lot of similar ideas, but had two different ways of accomplishing their goals. Um, just as like a foreshadowing as we move on, Johnson's foreign policy is wrapped up in Vietnam. The idea here is that it is going to be, trying to get my pen to work here, just like Kennedy, just like Eisenhower, just like Truman, it's going to be all about the policy of containment. Under the Johnson administration, it will be all about Vietnam. And that's something to keep in mind as we move forward. We talked about how JFK had sent advisors. We weren't fighting a war, but Kennedy sent 16,000 advisors. But by August of 1964, we are going to be fighting officially in the Vietnam War. Like I said, we had troops there on the ground, but there wasn't ever really a declaration of war or an official involvement. By 1965, we're up to hundreds of thousands of troops to help South Vietnam defeat the communists. And the longer we get into Johnson's presidency, the more desperate he's going to get and the more troops he's going to send over to stop the communists in Vietnam. Like I said, we're not going to get into that right now. It's just something to think about. We only talked about his successes right now. So it's important to remember his domestic policies were pretty successful at first, but his foreign policy is going to lead to his downfall. So what's next? So that concludes this unit when it comes to presentation and notes. I hope that you took some notes as you were watching and listening to this presentation. Um, I do want you to take a few minutes to review your notes, okay, once you're done with this. And then there are going to be 3 things that you need to do for me um, relating to President Johnson and the Great Society. And in the pages and in Canvas, I'll have everything linked for you, but there's going to be an analysis of the Great Society. I'm going to give you 4 different charts that reflect different areas of Johnson's Great Society, and you're going to analyze those charts and evaluate the success of the Great Society based on that document, and then you'll submit that. And then there's going to be a discussion post where basically we're asking you to evaluate President Johnson's presidency, his programming, his comparison to Kennedy. There are a list of prompts that you can choose from. And then at the end of the week, most likely Friday, you're going to have to take a quiz. I'm going to suggest that you take it Friday so that if you don't do well, you have the opportunity to take it again Saturday or Sunday before it locks. Um, so just kind of like an FYI as to what is coming after this presentation. And as always, please let me know if there is anything you need from me or any questions that you have.